Question 85 of Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 85. Of the effects of sin, and first, of the corruption of the good of nature, in 6 articles. We must now consider the effects of sin, and 1. The corruption of the good of nature. 2. The stain on the soul. 3. The debt of punishment. Under the first head there are 6 points of inquiry. First, whether the good of nature is diminished by sin. Second, whether it can be taken away altogether. Third, of the 4 wounds mentioned by Bede, with which human nature is stricken in consequence of sin. Fourth, whether privation of mode, species, and order is an effect of sin. Fifth, whether death and other bodily defects are the result of sin. Sixth, whether they are, in any way, natural to man. First article, whether sin diminishes the good of nature. Objection 1. It would seem that sin does not diminish the good of nature. For man's sin is no worse than the devil's. But natural good remains unimpaired in the devil's after sin, as Dionysius states in On the Divine Names 4. Therefore, neither does sin diminish the good of human nature. Objection 2. Further, when that which follows is changed, that which precedes remains unchanged, since substance remains the same when its accidents are changed. But nature exists before the voluntary action. Therefore, when a sin has caused a disorder in a voluntary act, nature is not changed on that account, so that the good of nature be diminished. Objection 3. Further, sin is an action, while diminution is a passion. Now no agent is passive by the very reason of its acting, although it is possible for it to act on one thing and to be passive as regards another. Therefore, he who sins does not, by his sin, diminish the good of his nature. Objection 4. Further, no accident acts on its subject, because that which is patient is potential being, while that which is subjected to an accident is already an actual being as regards that accident. But sin is in the good of nature as an accident in a subject. Therefore, sin does not diminish the good of nature, since to diminish is to act. On the contrary, as referred to in Luke 10 verse 30, a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, that is, to the corruption of sin, was stripped of his gifts and wounded in his nature, as Bede expounds the passage in his Glossa Ordinaria of Strabo. Therefore, sin diminishes the good of nature. I answer that the good of human nature is threefold. First, there are principles of which nature is constituted, and the properties that flow from them, such as the powers of the soul and so forth. Secondly, since man has from nature an inclination to virtue, as stated above, in Question 60, Article 1, as well as in Question 63, Article 1, this inclination to virtue is a good of nature. Thirdly, the gift of original justice, conferred on the whole of human nature in the person of the first man, may be called a good of nature. Accordingly, the first mentioned good of nature is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin. The third good of nature was entirely destroyed through the sin of our first parent. But the second good of nature, notably the natural inclination to virtue, is diminished by sin. Because human acts produce an inclination to like acts, as stated above, in question 50, Article 1. Now, from the very fact that thing becomes inclined to one of two contraries, its inclination to the other contrary must needs be diminished. Wherefore, as sin is opposed to virtue, from the very fact that a man sins, there results a diminution of that good of nature which is the inclination to virtue. Reply to Obj. 1. Dionysius is speaking of the first mentioned good of nature, which consists in being, living, and understanding, as anyone may see who reads the context. Reply to Obj. 2. Although nature precedes the voluntary action, it has an inclination to a certain voluntary action. Wherefore nature is not changed in itself through a change in the voluntary action. It is the inclination that is changed insofar as it is directed to its term. Reply to Obj. 3. A voluntary action proceeds from various powers, active and passive. The result is that, through voluntary actions, something is caused or taken away in the man who acts, as we have stated when treating of the production of habits, principally in question 51, Article 2. Reply to Obj. 4. An accident does not act effectively on its subject, but it acts on it formally, in the same sense as when we say that whiteness makes a thing white. In this way, there is nothing to hinder sin from diminishing the good of nature, but only insofar as sin is itself a diminution of the good of nature through being an inordinateness of action. But as regards the inordinateness of the agent, we must say that such like inordinateness is caused by the fact that in the acts of the soul there is an active and a passive element. Thus the sensible object moves the sensitive appetite, and the sensitive appetite inclines the reason and will, as stated above in question 77, Articles 1 and 2. The result of this is the inordinateness, not as though an accident acted on its own subject, but insofar as the object acts on the power, and one power acts on another and puts it out of order. Second article. Whether the entire good of human nature can be destroyed by sin. Objection 1. It would seem that the entire good of human nature can be destroyed by sin. For the good of human nature is finite, since human nature itself is finite. Now any finite thing is entirely taken away if the subtraction be continuous. Since, therefore, the good of nature can be continually diminished by sin, it seems that in the end it can be entirely taken away. Objection 2. Further, in a thing of one nature, the whole and the parts are uniform, as is evidently the case with air, water, flesh, and all bodies with similar parts. But the good of nature is wholly uniform. Since, therefore, a part thereof can be taken away by sin, it seems that the whole can also be taken away by sin. Objection 3. Further, the good of nature, that is weakened by sin, is aptitude for virtue. Now this aptitude is destroyed entirely in some on account of sin. Thus the lost cannot be restored to virtue any more than the blind can to sight. Therefore, sin can take away the good of nature entirely. On the contrary, Augustine says in his Enchiridion 14 that evil does not exist except in some good. But the evil of sin cannot be in the good of virtue or of grace, because they are contrary to it. Therefore, it must be in the good of nature, and consequently, it does not destroy it entirely. I answer that, as stated above in Article 1, the good of nature that is diminished by sin is the natural inclination to virtue, which is befitting to man from the very fact that he is a rational being, for it is due to this that he performs actions in accord with reason, which is to act virtuously. Now sin cannot entirely take away from man the fact that he is a rational being, for then he would no longer be capable of sin. Wherefore it is not possible for this good of nature to be destroyed entirely. Since, however, this same good of nature may be continually diminished by sin, some, in order to illustrate this, have made use of the example of a finite thing being diminished indefinitely, without being entirely destroyed. For the Philosopher says, in Phys. 1:37, that if from a finite magnitude a continual subtraction be made in the same quantity, it will at last be entirely destroyed. For instance, if from any finite length I continue to subtract the length of a span. If, however, the subtraction be made each time in the same proportion, and not in the same quantity, it may go on indefinitely, as, for instance, if a quantity be halved, and one half be diminished by half, it will be possible to go on thus indefinitely, provided that what is subtracted in each case be less than what was subtracted before. But this does not apply to the question at issue, since a subsequent sin does not diminish the good of nature less than a previous sin, but perhaps more, if it be a more grievous sin. We must therefore explain the matter otherwise, by saying that the aforesaid inclination is to be considered as a middle term between two others. For it is based on the rational nature as on its root, and tends to the good of virtue as to its term and end. Consequently, its diminution may be understood in two ways. First, on the part of its root; secondly, on the part of its term. In the first way, it is not diminished by sin, because sin does not diminish nature, as stated above in Article 1. But it is diminished in the second way, in so far as an obstacle is placed against its attaining its term. Now, if it were diminished in the first way, it would needs be entirely destroyed at last by the rational nature being entirely destroyed. Since, however, it is diminished on the part of the obstacle which is placed against its attaining its term, it is evident that it can be diminished indefinitely, because obstacles can be placed indefinitely, inasmuch as man can go on indefinitely adding sin to sin. And yet it cannot be destroyed entirely, because the root of this inclination always remains. An example of this may be seen in a transparent body, which has an inclination to receive light, from the very fact that it is transparent. Yet this inclination or aptitude is diminished on the part of supervening clouds, although it always remains rooted in the nature of the body. Reply to Obj. 1. This objection avails when diminution is made by subtraction. But here the diminution is made by raising obstacles, and this neither diminishes nor destroys the root of the inclination, as stated above. Reply to Obj. 2. The natural inclination is indeed wholly uniform, nevertheless it stands in relation both to its principle and to its term, in respect of which diversity of relation it is diminished on the one hand, and not on the other. Reply to Obj. 3. Even in the lost, the natural inclination to virtue remains, else they would have no remorse of conscience. That it is not reduced to act is owing to their being deprived of grace by divine justice. Thus, even in a blind man the aptitude to see remains in the very root of his nature, inasmuch as he is an animal naturally endowed with sight. Yet this aptitude is not reduced to act for the lack of a cause capable of reducing it, by forming the organ requisite for sight. Third article. Whether weakness, ignorance, malice, and concupiscence are suitably reckoned as the wounds of nature consequent upon sin. Objection 1. It would seem that weakness, ignorance, malice, and concupiscence are not suitably reckoned as the wounds of nature consequent upon sin. For one same thing is not both effect and cause of the same thing. But these are reckoned to be causes of sin, as appears from what has been said above, in question 76, Article 1, question 77, Articles 3 and 5, and in question 78, Article 1. Therefore, they should not be reckoned as effects of sin. Objection 2. Further, malice is the name of a sin. Therefore, it should have no place among the effects of sin. Objection 3. Further, concupiscence is something natural, since it is an act of the concupiscible power. But that which is natural should not be reckoned a wound of nature. Therefore, concupiscence should not be reckoned a wound of nature. Objection 4. Further, it has been stated in question 77, Article 3, that to sin from weakness is the same as to sin from passion. But concupiscence is a passion. Therefore, it should not be condivided with weakness. Objection 5. Further, Augustine, On Nature and Grace 67, reckons two things to be punishments inflicted on the soul of the sinner, notably ignorance and difficulty, from which arise error and vexation, which four do not coincide with the four in question. Therefore, it seems that one or the other reckoning is incomplete. On the contrary, the authority of Bede suffices. Translator's note: the reference is not known. I answer that, as a result of original justice, the reason had perfect hold over the lower parts of the soul, while reason itself was perfected by God and was subject to Him. Now this same original justice was forfeited through the sin of our first parent, as already stated in question 81, Article 2. So that all the powers of the soul are left, as it were, destitute of their proper order, whereby they are naturally directed to virtue, which destitution is called a wounding of nature. Again, there are four of the soul's powers that can be subject to virtue, as stated above, in question 61, Article 2. Notably, the reason, where prudence resides; the will, where justice is; the irascible, the subject of fortitude; and the concupiscible, the subject of temperance. Therefore, in so far as the reason is deprived of its order to the true, there is the wound of ignorance; in so far as the will is deprived of its order of good, there is the wound of malice; in so far as the irascible is deprived of its order to the arduous, there is the wound of weakness; and in so far as the concupiscible is deprived of its order to the delectable, moderated by reason, there is the wound of concupiscence. Accordingly, these are the four wounds inflicted on the whole of human nature as a result of our first parent's sin. But since the inclination to the good of virtue is diminished in each individual on account of actual sin, as was explained above in Articles 1 and 2, these 4 wounds are also the result of other sins, in so far as, through sin, the reason is obscured, especially in practical matters, the will hardened to evil, good actions become more difficult, and concupiscence more impetuous. Reply to Obj. 1. There is no reason why the effect of one sin should not be the cause of another, because the soul, through sinning once, is more easily inclined to sin again. Reply to Obj. 2. Malice is not to be taken here as a sin, but as a certain proneness of the will to evil, according to the words of Genesis 8:21. "Man's senses are prone to evil from his youth." Reply to Obj. 3. As stated above (Q. 82, Art. 3, first reply), concupiscence is natural to man, in so far as it is subject to reason; whereas, in so far as it goes beyond the bounds of reason, it is unnatural to man. Reply to Obj. 4. Speaking in a general way, every passion can be called a weakness, in so far as it weakens the soul's strength and clogs the reason. Bede, however, took weakness in the strict sense, as contrary to fortitude which pertains to the irascible. Reply to Obj. 5. The difficulty, which is mentioned in this book of Augustine, includes the 3 wounds affecting the appetitive powers, notably, malice, weakness, and concupiscence, for it is owing to these 3 that a man finds it difficult to tend to the good. Error and vexation are consequent wounds, since a man is vexed through being weakened in respect of the objects of his concupiscence. Fourth article. Whether privation of mode, species, and order is the effect of sin. Objection 1. It would seem that privation of mode, species, and order is not the effect of sin. For Augustine says On the Nature of the Good 3 that "where these 3 abound, the good is great; where they are less, there is less good; where they are not, there is no good at all." But sin does not destroy the good of nature. Therefore it does not destroy mode, species, and order. Obj. 2: Further, nothing is its own cause. But sin itself is the "privation of mode, species, and order," as Augustine states On the Nature of the Good 4. Therefore privation of mode, species, and order is not the effect of sin. Obj. 3: Further, different effects result from different sins. Now since mode, species, and order are diverse, their corresponding privations must be diverse also, and consequently must be the result of different sins. Therefore privation of mode, species, and order is not the effect of each sin. On the contrary, sin is to the soul what weakness is to the body, according to Psalm 6:3. "Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak." Now weakness deprives the body of mode, species, and order. I answer that, as stated in the first part, Q. 5, Art. 5, mode, species, and order are consequent upon every created good, as such, and also upon every being; because every being and every good, as such, depends on its form from which it derives its species. Again, any kind of form, whether substantial or accidental, of anything whatever, is according to some measure, wherefore it is stated in Metaph. VIII that "the forms of things are like numbers." so that a form has a certain mode corresponding to its measure. Lastly, owing to its form, each thing has a relation of order to something else. Accordingly, there are different grades of mode, species, and order, corresponding to the different degrees of good. For there is a good belonging to the very substance of nature, which good has its mode, species, and order, and is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin. There is again the good of the natural inclination, which also has its mode, species, and order, and this is diminished by sin, as stated above in Articles 1 and 2, but is not entirely destroyed. Again, there is the good of virtue and grace. This too has its mode, species, and order, and is entirely taken away by sin. Lastly, there is a good consisting in the ordinate act itself, which also has its mode, species, and order, the privation of which is essentially sin. Hence it is clear both how sin is privation of mode, species, and order, and how it destroys or diminishes mode, species, and order. This suffices for the replies to the first two objections. Reply to objection 3. Mode, species, and order follow one from the other, as explained above, and so they are destroyed or diminished together. Fifth article. Whether death and other bodily defects are the result of sin. Objection 1. It would seem that death and other bodily defects are not the result of sin, because equal causes have equal effects. Now these defects are not equal in all, but abound in some more than others, whereas original sin, from which especially these defects seem to result, is equal in all, as stated above in question 82, Article 4. Therefore, death and such like defects are not the result of sin. Objection 2. Further, if the cause is removed, the effect is removed. But these defects are not removed when all sin is removed by baptism or penance. Therefore, they are not the effect of sin. Objection 3. Further, actual sin has more of the character of guilt than original sin has. But actual sin does not change the nature of the body by subjecting it to some defect. Much less, therefore, does original sin. Therefore, death and other bodily defects are not the result of sin. On the contrary, the Apostle says in Romans 5:12, "By one man sin entered into this world, and by sin, death." I answer that, one thing causes another in two ways. First, by reason of itself. Secondly, accidentally. By reason of itself, one thing is the cause of another if it produces its effect by reason of the power of its nature or form, the result being that the effect is directly intended by the cause. Consequently, as death and such like defects are beside the intention of the sinner, it is evident that sin is not, of itself, the cause of these defects. Accidentally, one thing is the cause of another if it causes it by removing an obstacle. Thus it is stated in Phys. 8:32 that "by displacing a pillar, a man moves accidentally the stone resting thereon." In this way, the sin of our first parent is the cause of death and all such like defects in human nature, in so far as by the sin of our first parent, original justice was taken away, whereby not only were the lower powers of the soul held together under the control of reason, without any disorder whatever, but also the whole body was held together in subjection to the soul, without any defect, as stated in the first part, in question 97, Article 1. Wherefore original justice being forfeited through the sin of our first parent, just as human nature was stricken in the soul by the disorder among the powers, as stated above in Article 3, as well as in Question 82, Article 3. So also it became subject to corruption by reason of disorder in the body. Now the withdrawal of original justice has the character of punishment, even as the withdrawal of grace has. Consequently, death and all consequent bodily defects are punishments of original sin. And although the defects are not intended by the sinner, nevertheless they are ordered according to the justice of God, who inflicts them as punishments. Reply to Obj. 1. Causes that produce their effects of themselves, if equal, produce equal effects. For if such causes be increased or diminished, the effect is increased or diminished. But equal causes of an obstacle being removed do not point to equal effects. For supposing a man employs equal force in displacing two columns, it does not follow that the movements of the stones resting on them will be equal, but that one will move with greater velocity, which has the greater weight according to the property of its nature, to which it is left when the obstacle to its falling is removed. Accordingly, when original justice is removed, the nature of the human body is left to itself, so that according to diverse natural temperaments, some men's bodies are subject to more defects, some to fewer, although original sin is equal in all. Reply to Obj. 2. Both original and actual sin are removed by the same cause that removes these defects, according to the Apostle in Romans 8:11. He shall quicken your mortal bodies, because of his Spirit that dwelleth in you. But each is done according to the order of divine wisdom, at a fitting time. Because it is right that we should first of all be conformed to Christ's sufferings, before attaining to the immortality and impassibility of glory, which was begun in him, and by him acquired for us. Hence it behooves that our bodies should remain, for a time, subject to suffering, in order that we may merit the impassibility of glory in conformity with Christ. Reply to Obj. 3. Two things may be considered in actual sin: the substance of the act and the aspect of fault. As regards the substance of the act, actual sin can cause a bodily defect. Thus some sicken and die through eating too much. But as regards the fault, it deprives us of grace, which is given to us that we may regulate the acts of the soul, but not that we may ward off defects of the body, as original justice did. Wherefore, actual sin does not cause those defects as original sin does. Sixth Article. Whether death and other defects are natural to man. Objection 1. It would seem that death and such like defects are natural to man. For the corruptible and the incorruptible differ generically, according to Metaphysics 10:26. But man is of the same genus as other animals, which are naturally corruptible. Therefore, man is naturally corruptible. Objection 2: Further, whatever is composed of contraries is naturally corruptible, as having within itself the cause of corruption. But such is the human body. Therefore it is naturally corruptible. Obj. 3: Further, a hot thing naturally consumes moisture. Now human life is preserved by hot and moist elements. Since therefore the vital functions are fulfilled by the action of natural heat, as stated in De Anima ii, 50, it seems that death and such like defects are natural to man. On the contrary, 1. God made in man whatever is natural to him. Now, God made not death, according to Wisdom 1:13. Therefore, death is not natural to man. 2. Further, that which is natural cannot be called either a punishment or an evil, since what is natural to a thing is suitable to it. But death and such like defects are the punishment of original sin, as stated above in Article 5. Therefore, they are not natural to man. 3. Further, matter is proportionate to form, and everything to its end. Now man's end is everlasting happiness, as stated above, in Question 2, Article 7, as well as in Question 5, Articles 3 and 4. And the form of the human body is the rational soul, as was proved in the first part, Question 75, Article 6. Therefore, the human body is naturally incorruptible. I answer that, we may speak of any corruptible thing in two ways. First, in respect of its universal nature. Secondly, as regards its particular nature. A thing's particular nature is its own power of action and self-preservation. And in respect of this nature, every corruption and defect is contrary to nature, as stated in On the Heavens 2:37, since this power tends to the being and preservation of the thing to which it belongs. On the other hand, the universal nature is an active force in some universal principle of nature, for instance, in some heavenly body, or again belonging to some superior substance, in which sense God is said by some to be the nature who makes nature. This force intends the good and the preservation of the universe, for which alternate generation and corruption in things are requisite. And in this respect corruption and defect in things are natural, not indeed as regards the inclination of the form which is the principle of being and perfection, but as regards the inclination of matter which is allotted proportionately to its particular form, according to the discretion of the universal agent. And although every form intends perpetual being as far as it can, yet no form of a corruptible being can achieve its own perpetuity, except the rational soul, for the reason that the latter is not entirely subject to matter, as other forms are. Indeed, it has an immaterial operation of its own, as stated in the first part, Question 75, Article 2. Consequently, as regards his form, incorruption is more natural to man than to other corruptible things. But since that very form has a matter composed of contraries, from the inclination of that matter there results corruptibility in the whole. In this respect, man is naturally corruptible as regards the nature of his matter left to itself, but not as regards the nature of his form. The first three objections argue on the side of matter, while the other three argue on the side of the form. Wherefore, in order to solve them, we must observe that the form of man, which is the rational soul, in respect of its incorruptibility is adapted to its end, which is everlasting happiness, whereas the human body, which is corruptible, considered in respect of its nature, is, in a way, adapted to its form, and in another way it is not. For we may note a twofold condition in any matter, one which the agent chooses, and another which is not chosen by the agent, and is a natural condition of matter. Thus, a smith, in order to make a knife, chooses a matter both hard and flexible, which can be sharpened so as to be useful for cutting, and in respect of this condition, iron is a matter adapted for a knife. But that iron be breakable and inclined to rust results from the natural disposition of iron, nor does the workman choose this in the iron, indeed he would do without it if he could. Wherefore this disposition of matter is not adapted to the workman's intention, nor to the purpose of his art. In like manner, the human body is the matter chosen by nature in respect of its being of a mixed temperament, in order that it may be most suitable as an organ of touch and of the other sensitive and motive powers; whereas the fact that it is corruptible is due to a condition of matter, and is not chosen by nature. Indeed, nature would choose an incorruptible matter if it could. But God, to whom every nature is subject, in forming man, supplied the defect of nature, and by the gift of original justice, gave the body a certain incorruptibility, as was stated in the first part, in Question 97, Article 1. It is in this sense that it is said that God made not death, and that death is the punishment of sin. This suffices for the replies to the objections. End of question 85. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 86 of Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. By St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 86 of the stain of sin, in 2 articles. We must now consider the stain of sin, under which head there are 2 points of inquiry. First, whether an effect of sin is a stain on the soul. Second, whether it remains in the soul after the act of sin. First article: whether sin causes a stain on the soul. Objection 1. It would seem that sin causes no stain on the soul. For a higher nature cannot be defiled by contact with a lower nature. Hence the sun's ray is not defiled by contact with tainted bodies, as Augustine says. Now the human soul is of a much higher nature than mutable things, to which it turns by sinning. Therefore it does not contract a stain from them by sinning. Objection 2. Further, sin is chiefly in the will, as stated above in question 74, articles 1 and 2. Now the will is in the reason, as stated in On the Soul 342. But the reason or intellect is not stained by considering anything whatever. Rather, indeed, it is perfected thereby. Therefore, neither is the will stained by sin. Objection 3. Further, if sin causes a stain, this stain is either something positive or a pure privation. If it be something positive, it can only be either a disposition or a habit, for it seems that nothing else can be caused by an act. But it is neither disposition nor habit, for it happens that a stain remains even after the removal of a disposition or habit, for instance, in a man who, after committing a mortal sin of prodigality, is so changed as to fall into a sin of the opposite vice. Therefore, the stain does not denote anything positive in the soul. Again, neither is it a pure privation, because all sins agree on the part of aversion and privation of grace, and so it would follow that this is but one stain caused by all sins. Therefore, the stain is not the effect of sin. On the contrary, it was said to Solomon in Ecclesiasticus 47:22, "Thou hast stained thy glory," and it is written in Ephesians 5:27, "that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle." And in each case it is a question of the stain of sin. Therefore a stain is the effect of sin. I answer that, a stain is properly ascribed to corporeal things, when a comely body loses its comeliness through contact with another body, for example a garment, gold or silver or the like. Accordingly a stain is ascribed to spiritual things in like manner. Now man's soul has a twofold comeliness: one from the refulgence of the natural light of reason, whereby he is directed in his actions; the other from the refulgence of the divine light, notably, of wisdom and grace, whereby man is also perfected for the purpose of doing good and fitting actions. Now, when the soul cleaves to things by love, there is a kind of contact in the soul, and when man sins, he cleaves to certain things, against the light of reason and of the divine law, as shown above, Q. 71, A. 6. Wherefore, the loss of comeliness occasioned by this contact is metaphorically called a stain on the soul. Reply Obj. 1: The soul is not defiled by inferior things by their own power, as though they acted on the soul. On the contrary, the soul by its own action defiles itself, through cleaving to them inordinately, against the light of reason and of the divine law. Reply Obj. 2: The action of the intellect is accomplished by the intelligible thing being in the intellect, according to the mode of the intellect, so that the intellect is not defiled, but perfected by them. On the other hand, the act of the will consists in a movement towards things themselves, so that love attaches the soul to the thing loved. Thus it is that the soul is stained, when it cleaves inordinately, according to Hosea 9:10. "They became abominable as those things which they loved." Reply Obj. 3: The stain is neither something positive in the soul, nor does it denote a pure privation. It denotes a privation of the soul's brightness in relation to its cause, which is sin, wherefore diverse sins occasion diverse stains. It is like a shadow, which is the privation of light through the interposition of a body, and which varies according to the diversity of the interposed bodies. Second article: Whether the stain remains in the soul after the act of sin. Objection 1: It would seem that the stain does not remain in the soul after the act of sin. For after an action, nothing remains in the soul except habit or disposition. But the stain is not a habit or disposition, as stated above in A. 1, Obj. 3. Therefore the stain does not remain in the soul after the act of sin. Obj. 2: Further, the stain is to the sin what the shadow is to the body, as stated above in A. 1, third reply. But the shadow does not remain when the body has passed by. Therefore the stain does not remain in the soul when the act of sin is past. Obj. 3: Further, every effect depends on its cause. Now the cause of the stain is the act of sin. Therefore, when the act of sin is no longer there, neither is the stain in the soul. On the contrary, it is written in Joshua 22:17, "Is it a small thing to you that you sinned with Belphegor, and the stain of that crime remaineth in you to this day?" I answer that, the stain of sin remains in the soul even when the act of sin is past. The reason for this is that the stain, as stated above in Article 1, denotes a blemish in the brightness of the soul, on account of its withdrawing from the light of reason or of the divine law. And therefore, so long as man remains out of this light, the stain of sin remains in him. But as soon as, moved by grace, he returns to the divine light and to the light of reason, the stain is removed. For although the act of sin ceases, whereby man withdrew from the light of reason and of the divine law, man does not at once return to the state in which he was before, and it is necessary that his will should have a movement contrary to the previous movement. Thus, if one man be parted from another on account of some kind of movement, he is not reunited to him as soon as the movement ceases, but he needs to draw nigh to him and to return by a contrary movement. Reply to Obj. 1. Nothing positive remains in the soul after the act of sin, except the disposition or habit. But there does remain something privative, notably, the privation of union with the divine light. Reply to Obj. 2. After the interposed body has passed by, the transparent body remains in the same position and relation as regards the illuminating body, and so the shadow passes at once. But when the sin is past, the soul does not remain in the same relation to God, and so there is no comparison. Reply to Obj. 3. The act of sin parts man from God, which parting causes the defect of brightness, just as local movement causes local parting. Wherefore, just as when movement ceases, local distance is not removed, so neither when the act of sin ceases is the stain removed. End of question 86. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 87 of Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. By St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 87. Of the debt of punishment, in 8 articles. We must now consider the debt of punishment. We shall consider 1. The debt itself. 2. Mortal and venial sin, which differ in respect of the punishment due to them. Under the first head, there are 8 points of inquiry. First, whether the debt of punishment is an effect of sin. Second, whether one sin can be the punishment of another. Third, whether any sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment. Fourth, whether sin incurs a debt of punishment that is infinite in quantity. Fifth, whether every sin incurs a debt of eternal and infinite punishment. Sixth, whether the debt of punishment can remain after sin. Seventh, whether every punishment is inflicted for a sin. Eighth, whether one person can incur punishment for another's sin. First article. Whether the debt of punishment is an effect of sin. Objection 1. It would seem that the debt of punishment is not an effect of sin. For that which is accidentally related to a thing does not seem to be its proper effect. Now the debt of punishment is accidentally related to sin, for it is beside the intention of the sinner. Therefore, the debt of punishment is not an effect of sin. Obj. 2: Further, evil is not the cause of good. But punishment is good, since it is just, and is from God. Therefore it is not an effect of sin, which is evil. Obj. 3: Further, Augustine says in his Confessions I that "every inordinate affection is its own punishment." But punishment does not incur a further debt of punishment, because then it would go on indefinitely. Therefore sin does not incur the debt of punishment. On the contrary, it is written in Romans 2:9, "Tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that worketh evil." But to work evil is to sin. Therefore sin incurs a punishment which is signified by the words tribulation and anguish. I answer that, it has passed from natural things to human affairs that whenever one thing rises up against another, it suffers some detriment therefrom. For we observe in natural things that when one contrary supervenes, the other acts with greater energy, for which reason "hot water freezes more rapidly," as stated in Meteorology 1:12. Wherefore we find that the natural inclination of man is to repress those who rise up against him. Now it is evident that all things contained in an order are, in a manner, one, in relation to the principle of that order. Consequently, whatever rises up against an order is put down by that order or by the principle thereof. And because sin is an inordinate act, it is evident that whoever sins commits an offense against an order. Wherefore he is put down, in consequence, by that same order, which repression is punishment. Accordingly, man can be punished with a threefold punishment corresponding to the three orders to which the human will is subject. In the first place, a man's nature is subjected to the order of his own reason. Secondly, it is subjected to the order of another man who governs him either in spiritual or in temporal matters, as a member either of the state or of the household. Thirdly, it is subjected to the universal order of the divine government. Now each of these orders is disturbed by sin, for the sinner acts against his reason, and against human and divine law. Wherefore he incurs a threefold punishment: one, inflicted by himself, notably remorse of conscience; another, inflicted by man; and a third, inflicted by God. Reply Obj. 1: Punishment follows sin, inasmuch as this is an evil by reason of its being inordinate. Wherefore just as evil is accidental to the sinner's act, being beside his intention, so also is the debt of punishment. Reply Obj. 2: Further, a just punishment may be inflicted either by God or by man. Wherefore the punishment itself is the effect of sin, not directly, but dispositively. Sin, however, makes man deserving of punishment, and that is an evil. For Dionysius says (Div. Nom. iv) that "punishment is not an evil, but to deserve punishment is." Consequently, the debt of punishment is considered to be directly the effect of sin. Reply Obj. 3: This punishment of the inordinate affection is due to sin as overturning the order of reason. Nevertheless sin incurs a further punishment, though disturbing the order of the divine or human law. Second article. Whether sin can be the punishment of sin. Objection 1. It would seem that sin cannot be the punishment of sin. For the purpose of punishment is to bring man back to the good of virtue, as the Philosopher declares in Ethic. x, 9. Now sin does not bring man back to the good of virtue, but leads him in the opposite direction. Therefore sin is not the punishment of sin. Obj. 2: Further, just punishments are from God, as Augustine says in his 83 Questions, question 82. But sin is not from God, and is an injustice. Therefore sin cannot be the punishment of sin. Obj. 3. Further, the nature of punishment is to be something against the will. But sin is something from the will, as shown above in question 74, articles 1 and 2. Therefore sin cannot be the punishment of sin. On the contrary, Gregory speaks in his Homily 11 on Ezekiel that some sins are punishments of others. I answer that, we may speak of sin in two ways. First, in its essence as such. Secondly, as to that which is accidental thereto. Sin as such can nowise be the punishment of another, because sin considered in its essence is something proceeding from the will, for it is from this that it derives the character of guilt. Whereas punishment is essentially something against the will, as stated in the first part, question 48, article 5. Consequently, it is evident that sin regarded in its essence can nowise be the punishment of sin. On the other hand, sin can be the punishment of sin accidentally in three ways. First, when one sin is the cause of another, by removing an impediment thereto. For passions, temptations of the devil, and the like, are causes of sin, but are impeded by the help of divine grace, which is withdrawn on account of sin. Wherefore, since the withdrawal of grace is a punishment, and is from God, as stated above in question 79, article 3, the result is that the sin which ensues from this is also a punishment accidentally. It is in this sense that the Apostle speaks in Romans 1:24, when he says, "Wherefore God gave them up to the desires of their heart," that is, to their passions, because, to wit, when men are deprived of the help of divine grace, they are overcome by their passions. In this way, sin is always said to be the punishment of a preceding sin. Secondly, by reason of the substance of the act, which is such as to cause pain, whether it be an interior act, as is clearly the case with anger or envy, or an exterior act, as is the case with one who endures considerable trouble and loss in order to achieve a sinful act, according to Wisdom 5:7. "We wearied ourselves in the way of iniquity." Thirdly, on the part of the effect, so that one sin is said to be a punishment by reason of its effect. In the last two ways, a sin is a punishment not only in respect of a preceding sin, but also with regard to itself. Reply to Obj. 1: Even when God punishes men by permitting them to fall into sin, this is directed to the good of virtue. Sometimes indeed it is for the good of those who are punished, when, to wit, men arise from sin more humble and more cautious. But it is always for the amendment of others, who, seeing some men fall from sin to sin, are the more fearful of sinning. With regard to the other two ways, it is evident that the punishment is intended for the sinner's amendment, since the very fact that man endures toil and loss in sinning is of a nature to withdraw man from sin. Reply to Objection 2. This objection considers sin essentially as such, and the same answer applies to the third objection. Third article: whether any sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment. Objection 1. It would seem that no sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment. For a just punishment is equal to the fault, since justice is equality, wherefore it is written in Isaiah 28:7, "In measure against measure, when it shall be cast off, thou shalt judge it." Now sin is temporal. Therefore it does not incur a debt of eternal punishment. Obj. 2: Further, punishments are a kind of medicine, according to Ethic. ii, 3. But no medicine should be infinite, because it is directed to an end, and "what is directed to an end is not infinite," as the Philosopher states in Polit. I, 6. Therefore no punishment should be infinite. Obj. 3: Further, no one does a thing always unless he delights in it for its own sake. But "God hath not pleasure in the destruction of men." Therefore he will not inflict eternal punishment on man. Obj. 4: Further, nothing accidental is infinite. But punishment is accidental, for it is not natural to the one who is punished. Therefore it cannot be of infinite duration. On the contrary, it is written in Matthew 25:46, "These shall go into everlasting punishment," and in Mark 3:29, "He that shall blaspheme against the Holy Ghost shall never have forgiveness, but shall be guilty of an everlasting sin." I answer that, as stated above in Article 1, sin incurs a debt of punishment through disturbing an order. But the effect remains so long as the cause remains. Wherefore, so long as the disturbance of the order remains, the debt of punishment must needs remain also. Now disturbance of an order is sometimes reparable, sometimes irreparable: because a defect which destroys the principle is irreparable, whereas if the principle be saved, defects can be repaired by virtue of that principle. For instance, if the principle of sight be destroyed, sight cannot be restored except by divine power: whereas if the principle of sight be preserved, while there arise certain impediments to the use of sight, these can be remedied by nature or by art. Now in every order there is a principle whereby one takes part in that order. Consequently, if a sin destroys the principle of the order whereby man's will is subject to God, the disorder will be such as to be considered in itself irreparable, although it is possible to repair it by the power of God. Now the principle of this order is the last end, to which man adheres by charity. Therefore whatever sins turn man away from God, so as to destroy charity, considered in themselves incur a debt of eternal punishment. Reply to Obj. 1: Punishment is proportionate to sin in point of severity, both in divine and in human judgments. In no judgment, however, as Augustine says On the City of God 21:11, is it requisite for punishment to equal fault in point of duration. For the fact that adultery or murder is committed in a moment does not call for a momentary punishment. In fact, they are punished sometimes by imprisonment or banishment for life, sometimes even by death, wherein account is not taken of the time occupied in killing, but rather of the expediency of removing the murderer from the fellowship of the living, so that this punishment, in its own way, represents the eternity of punishment inflicted by God. Now, according to Gregory, in his Dialogues 444, it is just that he who has sinned against God in his own eternity should be punished in God's eternity. A man is said to have sinned in his own eternity, not only as regards continually sinning throughout his whole life, but also because, from the very fact that he fixes his end in sin, he has the will to sin, everlastingly. Wherefore Gregory says in his Dialogues 444 that "the wicked would wish to live without end, that they might abide in their sins forever." Reply Obj. 2: Even the punishment that is inflicted according to human laws is not always intended as a medicine for the one who is punished, but sometimes only for others. Thus when a thief is hanged, this is not for his own amendment, but for the sake of others, that at least they may be deterred from crime through fear of the punishment, according to Proverbs 19:25. "The wicked man being scourged, the fool shall be wiser." Accordingly, the eternal punishments inflicted by God on the reprobate are medicinal punishments for those who refrain from sin through the thought of those punishments, according to Psalm 59:6: "Thou hast given a warning to them that fear thee, that they may flee from before the bow, that they may be delivered." Reply Obj. 3: God does not delight in punishments for their own sake, but He does delight in the order of His justice, which requires them. Reply Obj. 4: Although punishment is related indirectly to nature, nevertheless it is essentially related to the disturbance of the order and to God's justice. Wherefore, so long as the disturbance lasts, the punishment endures. Fourth Article. Whether sin incurs a debt of punishment infinite in quantity? Objection 1. It would seem that sin incurs a debt of punishment infinite in quantity. For it is written in Jeremiah 10:24, "Correct me, O Lord, but yet with judgment, and not in thy fury, lest thou bring me to nothing." Now God's anger or fury signifies metaphorically the vengeance of divine justice, and to be brought to nothing is an infinite punishment, even as to make a thing out of nothing denotes infinite power. Therefore, according to God's vengeance, sin is awarded a punishment infinite in quantity. Objection 2: Further, quantity of punishment corresponds to quantity of fault, according to Deuteronomy 25:2. "According to the measure of the sin shall the measure also of the stripes be." Now a sin which is committed against God is infinite, because the gravity of a sin increases according to the greatness of the person sinned against. Thus it is a more grievous sin to strike the sovereign than a private individual. And God's greatness is infinite. Therefore an infinite punishment is due for a sin committed against God. Objection 3. Further, a thing may be infinite in two ways: in duration and in quantity. Now the punishment is infinite in duration. Therefore it is infinite in quantity also. On the contrary, if this were the case, the punishments of all mortal sins would be equal, because one infinite is not greater than another. I answer that punishment is proportionate to sin. Now sin comprises two things. First, there is the turning away from the immutable good, which is infinite. Wherefore, in this respect, sin is infinite. Secondly, there is the inordinate turning to mutable good. In this respect, sin is finite, both because the mutable good itself is finite, and because the movement of turning towards it is finite, since the acts of a creature cannot be infinite. Accordingly, in so far as sin consists in turning away from something, its corresponding punishment is the pain of loss, which also is infinite, because it is the loss of the infinite good, that is, God. But in so far as sin turns inordinately to something, its corresponding punishment is the pain of sense, which is also finite. Reply to Obj. 1. It would be inconsistent with divine justice for the sinner to be brought to nothing absolutely, because this would be incompatible with the perpetuity of punishment that divine justice requires, as stated above in Article 3. The expression "to be brought to nothing" is applied to one who is deprived of spiritual goods, according to 1 Corinthians 13:2. "If I have not charity, I am nothing." Reply to Obj. 2. This argument considers sin as turning away from something, for it is thus that man sins against God. Reply to Obj. 3. Duration of punishment corresponds to duration of fault, not indeed as regards the act, but on the part of the stain, for as long as this remains, the debt of punishment remains. But punishment corresponds to fault in the point of severity. And a fault which is irreparable is such that, of itself, it lasts forever, wherefore it incurs an everlasting punishment. But it is not infinite as regards the thing it turns to, wherefore in this respect it does not incur punishment of infinite quantity. Fifth article. Whether every sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment? Objection 1. It would seem that every sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment. Because punishment, as stated above in Article 4, is proportionate to the fault. Now, eternal punishment differs infinitely from temporal punishment, whereas no sin, apparently, differs infinitely from another, since every sin is a human act, which cannot be infinite. Since, therefore, some sins incur a debt of everlasting punishment, as stated above in Article 4, it seems that no sin incurs a debt of mere temporal punishment. Objection 2: Further, original sin is the least of all sins, wherefore Augustine says in his Enchiridion 93 that "the lightest punishment is incurred by those who are punished for original sin alone." But original sin incurs everlasting punishment, since children who have died in original sin through not being baptized will never see the kingdom of God, as shown by our Lord's words in John 3:3, "Unless a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Much more, therefore, will the punishments of all other sins be everlasting. Obj. 3: Further, a sin does not deserve greater punishment through being united to another sin. For divine justice has allotted its punishment to each sin. Now a venial sin deserves eternal punishment if it be united to a mortal sin in a lost soul, because in hell there is no remission of sins. Therefore venial sin by itself deserves eternal punishment. Therefore temporal punishment is not due for any sin. On the contrary, Gregory says in his Dialogues 439 that certain slighter sins are remitted after this life. Therefore all sins are not punished eternally. I answer that, as stated above in Article 3, a sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment in so far as it causes an irreparable disorder in the order of divine justice, through being contrary to the very principle of that order, notably the last end. Now it is evident that in some sins there is disorder indeed, but not such as not to involve contrariety in respect of the last end, but only in respect of things referable to the end, in so far as one is too much or too little intent on them, without prejudicing the order to the last end: as for instance when a man is too fond of some temporal thing, yet would not offend God for its sake, by breaking one of His commandments. Consequently such sins do not incur everlasting, but only temporal punishment. Reply to Obj. 1: Sins do not differ infinitely from one another in respect of their turning towards mutable good, which constitutes the substance of the sinful act. But they do differ infinitely in respect of their turning away from something. Because some sins consist in turning away from the last end, and some in a disorder affecting things referable to the end. And the last end differs infinitely from the things that are referred to it. Reply to Obj. 2: Original sin incurs everlasting punishment, not on account of its gravity, but by reason of the condition of the subject, notably a human being deprived of grace, without which there is no remission of sin. The same answer applies to the third objection about venial sin, because eternity of punishment does not correspond to the quantity of sin, but to its irremissibility, as stated above in Article 3. Sixth Article: Whether the debt of punishment remains after sin. Objection 1: It would seem that there remains no debt of punishment after sin. For if the cause be removed, the effect is removed. But sin is the cause of the debt of punishment. Therefore, when the sin is removed, the debt of punishment ceases also. Obj. 2: Further, sin is removed by man returning to virtue. Now a virtuous man deserves not punishment, but reward. Therefore, when sin is removed, the debt of punishment no longer remains. Obj. 3: Further, punishments are a kind of medicine, according to Ethic. ii, 3. But a man is not given medicine after being cured of his disease. Therefore, when sin is removed, the debt of punishment does not remain. On the contrary, it is written in 2 Kings 12:13, 14: "David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, The Lord also hath taken away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Nevertheless, because thou hast given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child that is born to thee shall die. Therefore, a man is punished by God even after his sin is forgiven, and so the debt of punishment remains when the sin has been removed. I answer that two things may be considered in sin: the guilty act and the consequent stain. Now it is evident that in all actual sins, when the act of sin has ceased, the guilt remains. Because the act of sin makes man deserving of punishment in so far as he transgresses the order of divine justice, to which he cannot return except he pay some sort of penal compensation, which restores him to the equality of justice. So that, according to the order of divine justice, he who has been too indulgent to his will by transgressing God's commandments, suffers, either willingly or unwillingly, something contrary to what he would wish. This restoration of the equality of justice by penal compensation is also to be observed in injuries done to one's fellow men. Consequently, it is evident that when the sinful or injurious act has ceased, there still remains the debt of punishment. But if we speak of the removal of sin as to the stain, it is evident that the stain of sin cannot be removed from the soul without the soul being united to God, since it was through being separated from Him that it suffered the loss of its brightness, in which the stain consists, as stated above in Q. 86, A. 1. Now man is united to God by his will. Wherefore the stain of sin cannot be removed from man unless his will accept the order of divine justice, that is to say, unless either of his own accord he take upon himself the punishment of his past sin, or bear patiently the punishment which God inflicts on him. And in both ways punishment avails for satisfaction. Now when punishment is satisfactory, it loses somewhat of the nature of punishment. For the nature of punishment is to be against the will, and although satisfactory punishment, absolutely speaking, is against the will, nevertheless in this particular case, and for this particular purpose, it is voluntary. Consequently, it is voluntary simply, but involuntary in a certain respect, as we have explained when speaking of the voluntary and the involuntary, in Q. 6, A. 6. We must therefore say that, when the stain of sin has been removed, there may remain a debt of punishment, not indeed of punishment simply, but of satisfactory punishment. Reply to Obj. 1: Just as after the act of sin has ceased, the stain remains, as stated above in Q. 86, A. 2, so the debt of punishment also can remain. But when the stain has been removed, the debt of punishment does not remain in the same way, as stated. Reply to Obj. 2: The virtuous man does not deserve punishment simply, but he may deserve it as satisfactory, because his very virtue demands that he should do satisfaction for his offenses against God or man. Reply to Obj. 3: When the stain is removed, the wound of sin is healed as regards the will. But punishment is still requisite in order that the other powers of the soul be healed, since they were so disordered by the sin committed, so that, to wit, the disorder may be remedied by the contrary of that which caused it. Moreover, punishment is requisite in order to restore the equality of justice, and to remove the scandal given to others, so that those who were scandalized at the sin may be edified by the punishment, as may be seen in the example of David quoted above. Seventh Article. Whether every punishment is inflicted for a sin? Objection 1. It would seem that not every punishment is inflicted for a sin. For it is written in John 9 about the man born blind, "Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, that he should be born blind." In like manner, we see that many children, those also who have been baptized, suffer grievous punishments, fevers, for instance, diabolical possession, and so forth, and yet there is no sin in them after they have been baptized. Moreover, before they are baptized, there is no more sin in them than in the other children who do not suffer such things. Therefore, not every punishment is inflicted for a sin. Obj. 2: Further, that sinners should thrive and that the innocent should be punished seem to come under the same head. Now each of these is frequently observed in human affairs, for it is written about the wicked in Psalm 72 verse 5, "They are not in the labor of men, neither shall they be scourged like other men." And in Job 21:7, "Why then do the wicked live? Are they advanced, and strengthened with riches?" Therefore, not every punishment is inflicted for a sin. Obj. 3: Further, it is written of Christ in 1 Peter 2:22 that "He did no sin, nor was guile found in his mouth." And yet it is said in 1 Peter 2, verse 21 that "He suffered for us." Therefore, punishment is not always inflicted by God for sin. On the contrary, it is written in Job verse 7 and following, "Who ever perished innocent, or when were the just destroyed? I have seen those who work iniquity perishing by the blast of God." And Augustine writes in his Retractions 1 that "all punishment is just and is afflicted for a sin." I answer that, as already stated in Article 6, punishment can be considered in two ways: simply, and as being satisfactory. A satisfactory punishment is, in a way, voluntary. And since those who differ as to the debt of punishment may be one in will by the union of love, it happens that one who has not sinned bears willingly the punishment for another. Thus even in human affairs we see men take the debts of another upon themselves. If, however, we speak of punishment simply, in respect of its being something penal, it has always a relation to a sin in the one punished. Sometimes this is a relation to actual sin, as when a man is punished by God or man for a sin committed by him. Sometimes it is a relation to original sin, and this either principally or consequently. Principally, the punishment of original sin is that human nature is left to itself and deprived of original justice. And consequently, all the penalties which result from this defect in human nature. Nevertheless, we must observe that sometimes a thing seems penal, and yet is not so simply. Because punishment is a species of evil, as stated in the first part, Q. 48, A. 5. Now evil is privation of good. And since man's good is manifold, notably, good of the soul, good of the body, and external goods, It happens sometimes that man suffers the loss of a lesser good, that he may profit in a greater good, as when he suffers loss of money for the sake of bodily health, or loss of both of these, for the sake of his soul's health and the glory of God. In such cases, the loss is an evil to man, not simply, but relatively. Wherefore it does not answer to the name of punishment simply, but of medicinal punishment, because a medical man prescribes bitter potions to his patients, that he may restore them to health. And since such like are not punishments properly speaking, they are not referred to sin as their cause, except in a restricted sense. Because the very fact that human nature needs a treatment of penal medicines is due to the corruption of nature, which is itself the punishment of original sin. For there was no need in the state of innocence for penal exercises in order to make progress in virtue, so that whatever is penal in the exercise of virtue is reduced to original sin as its cause. Reply to Obj. 1: Such like defects of those who are born with them, or which children suffer from, are the effects and the punishments of original sin, as stated above in Q. 85, A. 5. And they remain even after baptism, for the cause stated above, in Q. 85, A. 5, second reply. And that they are not equally in all is due to the diversity of nature, which is left to itself, as stated above in Q. 85, A. 5, first reply. Nevertheless, they are directed by divine providence to the salvation of men, either of those who suffer, or of others who are admonished by their means, and also to the glory of God. Reply to Obj. 2: Temporal and bodily goods are indeed goods of man, but they are of small account, whereas spiritual goods are man's chief goods. Consequently, it belongs to divine justice to give spiritual goods to the virtuous, and to award them as much temporal goods or evils as suffices for virtue. For as Dionysius says (On the Divine Names viii), "Divine justice does not enfeeble the fortitude of the virtuous man by material gifts." The very fact that others receive temporal goods is detrimental to their spiritual good, wherefore the psalm quoted concludes in verse 6: "Therefore pride hath held them fast." Reply to Obj. 3: Christ bore a satisfactory punishment, not for his, but for our sins. Eighth Article. Whether anyone is punished for another's sin? Objection 1: It would seem that one may be punished for another's sin. For it is written in Exodus 20:5: "I am God, jealous, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." And in Matthew 23:35: "That upon you may come all the just blood that hath been shed upon the earth." Obj. 2: Further, human justice springs from divine justice. Now, according to human justice, children are sometimes punished for their parents, as in the case of high treason. Therefore also, according to divine justice, one is punished for another's sin. Obj. 3: Further, if it be replied that the son is punished, not for the father's sin, but for his own, inasmuch as he imitates his father's wickedness, this would not be said of the children rather than of outsiders, who are punished in like manner as those whose crimes they imitate. It seems, therefore, that children are punished not for their own sins, but for those of their parents. On the contrary, it is written in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, "The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father." I answer that, if we speak of that satisfactory punishment which one takes upon oneself voluntarily, one may bear another's punishment, in so far as they are, in some way, one, as stated above in Article 7. If, however, we speak of punishment inflicted on account of sin, inasmuch as it is penal, then each one is punished for his own sin only, because the sinful act is something personal. But if we speak of a punishment that is medicinal, in this way it does happen that one is punished for another's sin. For it has been stated in Article 7 that ills sustained in bodily goods, or even in the body itself, are medicinal punishments intended for the health of the soul. Wherefore, there is no reason why one should not have such like punishments inflicted on one for another's sin, either by God or by man. For example, on children for their parents, or on servants for their masters, inasmuch as they are their property, so to speak. In such a way, however, that if the children or the servants take part in the sin, this penal ill has the character of punishment in regard to both the one punished and the one he is punished for. But if they do not take part in the sin, it has the character of punishment in regard to the one for whom the punishment is borne, while in regard to the one who is punished, it is merely medicinal, except accidentally if he consent to the other's sin, since it is intended for the good of his soul, if he bears it patiently. With regard to spiritual punishments, these are not merely medicinal, because the good of the soul is not directed to a yet higher good. Consequently, no one suffers loss in the goods of the soul without some fault of his own. Wherefore Augustine says, "Such like punishments are not inflicted on one for another's sin, because, as regards the soul, the son is not the father's property." Hence the Lord assigns the reason for this by saying, in Ezekiel 18:4, "All souls are mine." Reply to Obj. 1: Both the passages quoted should, seemingly, be referred to temporal or bodily punishments, in so far as children are the property of their parents, and posterity of their forefathers. Else, if they be referred to spiritual punishments, they must be understood in reference to the imitation of sin, wherefore in Exodus these words are added, "of them that hate me." And in the chapter quoted from Matthew, in verse 32, we read, "Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers." The sins of the fathers are said to be punished in their children, because the latter are the more prone to sin through being brought up amid their parents' crimes, both by becoming accustomed to them, and by imitating their parents' example, conforming to their authority, as it were. Moreover, they deserve heavier punishment if, seeing the punishment of their parents, they fail to mend their ways. The text adds, "to the third and fourth generation," because men are wont to live long enough to see the third and fourth generation, so that both the children can witness their parents' sins so as to imitate them, and the parents can see their children's punishments so as to grieve for them. Reply to Obj. 2: The punishments which human justice inflicts on one for another's sin are bodily and temporal. they are also remedies or medicines against future sins, in order that either they who are punished or others may be restrained from similar faults. Reply Obj. 3: Those who are near of kin are said to be punished, rather than outsiders, for the sins of others, because both the punishment of kindred redounds somewhat upon those who sinned, as stated above, in so far as the child is the father's property, and because the examples and the punishments that occur in one's own household are more moving. Consequently, when a man is brought up amid the sins of his parents, he is more eager to imitate them, and if he is not deterred by their punishments, he would seem to be the more obstinate, and therefore to deserve more severe punishment. End of question 87. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 88 of Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. By St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 88. Of venial and mortal sin, in 6 articles. In the next place, since venial and mortal sins differ in respect of the debt of punishment, we must consider them. First, we shall consider venial sin as compared with mortal sin. Secondly, we shall consider venial sin in itself. Under the first head there are 6 points of inquiry. First, whether venial sin is fittingly condivided with mortal sin. Second, whether they differ generically. Third, whether venial sin is a disposition to mortal sin. Fourth, whether a venial sin can become mortal. Fifth, whether a venial sin can become mortal by reason of an aggravating circumstance. Sixth, whether a mortal sin can become venial. First article: whether venial sin is fittingly condivided with mortal sin. Objection 1. It would seem that venial sin is unfittingly condivided with mortal sin. For Augustine says in Against Faustus the Manichae 22:27, "Sin is a word, deed, or desire contrary to the eternal law." But the fact of being against the eternal law makes a sin to be mortal. Consequently, every sin is mortal. Therefore, venial sin is not condivided with mortal sin. Obj. 2: Further, the Apostle says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, "Whether you eat or drink, or whatever else you do, do all to the glory of God." Now, whoever sins breaks this commandment, because sin is not done for God's glory. Consequently, since to break a commandment is to commit a mortal sin, it seems that whoever sins, sins mortally. Obj. 3: Further, whoever cleaves to a thing by love, cleaves either as enjoying it or as using it, as Augustine states On Christian Teaching I, 3, 4. But no person, in sinning, cleaves to a mutable good as using it, because he does not refer it to that good which gives us happiness, which, properly speaking, is to use, according to Augustine, again, On Christian Teaching 1, 3, 4. Therefore, whoever sins enjoys a mutable good. Now, to enjoy what we should use is human perverseness, as Augustine again says in his 83 Questions, question 30. Therefore, since perverseness denotes a mortal sin, it seems that whoever sins, sins mortally. Translator's note: the Latin pervertere means to overthrow, to destroy. Hence, perversion of God's law is a mortal sin. Objection 4: Further, whoever approaches one term, from that very fact turns away from the opposite. Now whoever sins approaches a mutable good, and, consequently, turns away from the immutable good, so that he sins mortally. Therefore, venial sin is unfittingly condivided with mortal sin. On the contrary, Augustine says in his commentary on John 41 that a crime is one that merits damnation, and a venial sin one that does not. But a crime denotes a mortal sin. Therefore, venial sin is fittingly condivided with mortal sin. I answer that certain terms do not appear to be mutually opposed, if taken in their proper sense, whereas they are opposed if taken metaphorically. Thus, to smile is not opposed to being dry. But if we speak of the smiling meadows, when they are decked with flowers and fresh with green hues, this is opposed to drought. In like manner, if mortal be taken literally, as referring to the death of the body, it does not imply opposition to venial, nor belong to the same genus. But if mortal be taken metaphorically, as applied to sin, it is opposed to that which is venial. For sin, being a sickness of the soul, as stated above, in question 71, Article 1, third reply, as well as in question 72, Article 5, and question 74, Article 9, second reply, is said to be mortal by comparison with a disease, which is said to be mortal through causing an irreparable defect consisting in the corruption of a principle, as stated above in question 72, Article 5. Now the principle of the spiritual life, which is a life in accord with virtue, is the order to the last end, as stated above, in question 72, Article 5, and in question 87, Article 3. And if this order be corrupted, it cannot be repaired by any intrinsic principle, but by the power of God alone, as stated above in question 87, Article 3. Because disorders in things referred to the end are repaired through the end, even as an error about conclusions can be repaired through the truth of the principles. Hence, the defect of order to the last end cannot be repaired through something else as a higher principle, as neither can any error about principles. Wherefore such sins are called mortal, as being irreparable. On the other hand, sins which imply a disorder in things referred to the end, the order to the end itself being preserved, are reparable. These sins are called venial, because a sin receives its acquittal, veniam, when the debt of punishment is taken away, and this ceases when the sin ceases, as explained above, in question 87, Article 6. Accordingly, mortal and venial are mutually opposed as reparable and irreparable. And I say this with reference to the intrinsic principle, but not to the divine power, which can repair all diseases, whether of the body or of the soul. Therefore venial sin is fittingly condivided with mortal sin. Reply Obj. 1: The division of sin into venial and mortal is not a division of genus into its species which have an equal share of the generic nature; but it is the division of an analogous term into its parts, of which it is predicated, of the one first and of the other afterwards. Consequently, the perfect notion of sin, which Augustine gives, applies to mortal sin. On the other hand, venial sin is called a sin in reference to an imperfect notion of sin and in relation to mortal sin, even as an accident is called a being in relation to substance, in reference to the imperfect notion of being. For it is not against the law, since he who sins venially neither does what the law forbids, nor omits what the law prescribes to be done, but he acts beside the law, through not observing the mode of reason which the law intends. Reply Obj. 2: This precept of the Apostle is affirmative, and so it does not bind for all times. Consequently, everyone who does not actually refer all his actions to the glory of God, does not therefore act against this precept. In order therefore to avoid mortal sin each time that one fails actually to refer an action to God's glory, it is enough to refer oneself and all that one has to God habitually. Now venial sin excludes only actual reference of the human act to God's glory, and not habitual reference, because it does not exclude charity, which refers man to God habitually. Therefore it does not follow that he who sins venially sins mortally. Reply Obj. 3: He that sins venially cleaves to temporal good, not as enjoying it, because he does not fix his end in it, but as using it, by referring it to God, not actually, but habitually. Reply Obj. 4: Mutable good is not considered to be a term in contraposition to the immutable good, unless one's end is fixed therein, because what is referred to the end has not the character of finality. Second article: Whether mortal and venial sin differ generically. Objection 1: It would seem that venial and mortal sin do not differ generically, so that some sins be generically mortal and some generically venial. Because human acts are considered to be generically good or evil according to their matter or object, as stated above in Q. 18, A. 2. Now either mortal or venial sin may be committed in regard to any object or matter, since man can love any mutable good, either less than God, which may be a venial sin, or more than God, which is a mortal sin. Therefore venial and mortal sin do not differ generically. Obj. 2: Further, as stated above in A. 1, and in Q. 72, A. 5, and in Q. 87, A. 3, a sin is called mortal when it is irreparable, venial when it can be repaired. Now irreparability belongs to sin committed out of malice, which, according to some, is irremissible, whereas reparability belongs to sins committed through weakness or ignorance, which are remissible. Therefore mortal and venial sin differ, as sin committed through malice differs from sin committed through weakness or ignorance. But in this respect sins differ not in genus, but in cause, as stated above in Q. 77, A. 8, first reply. Therefore venial and mortal sin do not differ generically. Obj. 3: Further, it was stated above in Q. 74, A. 3, third reply, and in A. 10, that sudden movements both of the sensuality and of the reason are venial sins. But sudden movements occur in every kind of sin. Therefore no sins are generically venial. On the contrary, Augustine, in a sermon on Purgatory (Hom. 41), enumerates certain generic venial sins, and certain generic mortal sins. I answer that, venial sin is so called from venia, pardon. Consequently, a sin may be called venial, first of all, because it has been pardoned. Thus Ambrose says that penance makes every sin venial. And this is called venial from the result. Secondly, a sin is called venial because it does not contain anything either partially or totally, to prevent its being pardoned. Partially, as when a sin contains something diminishing its guilt, for example, a sin committed through weakness or ignorance. And this is called venial from the cause. Totally, through not destroying the order to the last end, wherefore it deserves temporal, but not everlasting punishment. It is of this venial sin that we wish to speak now. For as regards the first two, it is evident that they have no determinate genus, whereas venial sin, taken in the third sense, can have a determinate genus, so that one may be venial generically, and another generically mortal, according as the genus or species of an act is determined by its object. For when the will is directed to a thing that is in itself contrary to charity, whereby man is directed to his last end, the sin is mortal by reason of its object. Consequently, it is a mortal sin generically, whether it be contrary to the love of God, for example, blasphemy, perjury, and the like, or against the love of one's neighbor, for example, murder, adultery, and such like. Wherefore such sins are mortal by reason of their genus. Sometimes, however, the sinner's will is directed to a thing containing a certain inordinateness, but which is not contrary to the love of God and one's neighbor, for example, an idle word, excessive laughter, and so forth, and such sins are venial by reason of their genus. Nevertheless, since moral acts derive their character of goodness and malice not only from their objects, but also from some disposition of the agent, as stated above in Q. 18, A. 4 and 6, it happens sometimes that a sin which is venial generically by reason of its object, becomes mortal on the part of the agent, either because he fixes his last end therein, or because he directs it to something that is a mortal sin in its own genus. For example, if a man direct an idle word to the commission of adultery. In like manner it may happen, on the part of the agent, that a sin generically mortal becomes venial, by reason of the act being imperfect, that is, not deliberated by reason, which is the proper principle of an evil act, as we have said above in reference to sudden movements of unbelief. Reply to Obj. 1: The very fact that anyone chooses something that is contrary to divine charity, proves that he prefers it to the love of God, and consequently that he loves it more than he loves God. Hence it belongs to the genus of some sins, which are of themselves contrary to charity, that something is loved more than God, so that they are mortal by reason of their genus. Reply Obj. 2. This argument considers those sins which are venial from their cause. Reply Obj. 3. This argument considers those sins which are venial by reason of the imperfection of the act. Third article. Whether venial sin is a disposition to mortal sin. Objection 1. It would seem that venial sin is not a disposition to mortal sin. For one contrary does not dispose to another. But venial and mortal sin are condivided as contrary to one another, as stated above in Article 1. Therefore, venial sin is not a disposition to mortal sin. Objection 2. Further, an act disposes to something of like species. Wherefore it is stated in Ethics 2, 1 and 2 that "from like acts, like dispositions and habits are engendered." But mortal and venial sin differ in genus or species, as stated above in Article 2. Therefore, venial sin does not dispose to mortal sin. Objection 3. Further, if a sin is called venial because it disposes to mortal sin, it follows that whatever disposes to mortal sin is a venial sin. Now every good work disposes to mortal sin, wherefore Augustine says in his rule that "pride lies in wait for good works, that it may destroy them." Therefore, even good works would be venial sins, which is absurd. On the contrary, it is written in Ecclesiasticus 19:1, "He that contemneth small things shall fall little by little." Now he that sins venially seems to contemn small things. Therefore, by little and little he is disposed to fall away together into mortal sin. I answer that, a disposition is a kind of cause. Wherefore, as there is a twofold manner of cause, so is there a twofold manner of disposition. For there is cause which moves directly to the production of the effect, as a hot thing heats. And there is a cause which moves indirectly, by removing an obstacle, as he who displaces a pillar is said to displace the stone that rests on it. Accordingly, an act of sin disposes to something in two ways. First, directly, and thus it disposes to an act of like species. In this way, a sin generically venial does not, primarily and of its nature, dispose to a sin generically mortal, for they differ in species. Nevertheless, in this same way, a venial sin can dispose, by way of consequence, to a sin which is mortal on the part of the agent. Because the disposition or habit may be so far strengthened by acts of venial sin, that the lust of sinning increases, and the sinner fixes his end in that venial sin. Since the end for one who has a habit, as such, is to work according to that habit, and the consequence will be that, by sinning often venially, he becomes disposed to a mortal sin. Secondly, a human act disposes to something by removing an obstacle thereto. In this way, a sin generically venial can dispose to a sin generically mortal. Because he that commits a sin generically venial turns aside from some particular order, and through accustoming his will not to be subject to the due order in lesser matters, is disposed not to subject his will even to the order of the last end, by choosing something that is a mortal sin in its genus. Reply to Obj. 1: Venial and mortal sin are not condivided in contrariety to one another, as though they were species of one genus, as stated above (A. 1, ad 1), but as an accident is condivided with substance. Wherefore, as an accident can be a disposition to a substantial form, so can a venial sin dispose to mortal. Reply to Obj. 2: Venial sin is not like mortal sin in species, but it is in genus, inasmuch as they both imply a defect of due order, albeit in different ways, as stated in Articles 1 and 2. Reply to Obj. 3: A good work is not, of itself, a disposition to mortal sin, but it can be the matter or occasion of mortal sin accidentally, whereas a venial sin, of its very nature, disposes to mortal sin, as stated. Fourth article: Whether a venial sin can become mortal? Objection 1: It would seem that a venial sin can become a mortal sin. For Augustine, in explaining the words of John 3:36, "He that believeth not the Son shall not see life," says: "The slightest sins," that is, venial, "kill if we make little of them." Now a sin is called mortal through causing the spiritual death of the soul. Therefore a venial sin can become mortal. Obj. 2: Further, a movement in the sensuality before the consent of reason is a venial sin, but after consent is a mortal sin, as stated above in Q. 74, A. 8, second reply. Therefore a venial sin can become mortal. Obj. 3: Further, venial and mortal sin differ as curable and incurable disease, as stated above in A. 1. But a curable disease may become incurable. Therefore a venial sin may become mortal. Obj. 4: Further, a disposition may become a habit. Now venial sin is a disposition to mortal, as stated above in A. 3. Therefore a venial sin can become mortal. I answer that, the fact of a venial sin becoming a mortal sin may be understood in three ways. First, so that the same identical act be at first a venial, and then a mortal sin. This is impossible, because a sin, like any moral act, consists chiefly in an act of the will, so that an act is not one morally if the will be changed, although the act be continuous physically. If, however, the will be not changed, it is not possible for a venial sin to become mortal. Secondly, this may be taken to mean that a sin generically venial becomes mortal. This is possible, in so far as one may fix one's end in that venial sin, or direct it to some mortal sin as end, as stated above in A. 2. Thirdly, this may be understood in the sense of many venial sins constituting one mortal sin. If this be taken as meaning that many venial sins added together make one mortal sin, it is false, because all the venial sins in the world cannot incur a debt of punishment equal to that of one mortal sin. This is evident as regards the duration of the punishment, since mortal sin incurs a debt of eternal punishment, while venial sin incurs a debt of temporal punishment, as stated above in Q. 87, Articles 3 and 5. It is also evident as regards the pain of loss, because mortal sins deserve to be punished by the privation of seeing God, to which no other punishment is comparable, as Chrysostom states in his Homily 24 on the Gospel of Matthew. It is also evident as regards the pain of sense, as to the remorse of conscience, although as to the pain of fire, the punishments may perhaps not be improportionate to one another. If, however, this be taken as meaning that many venial sins make one mortal sin dispositively, it is true, as was shown above in Article 3, with regard to the two different manners of disposition, whereby venial sin disposes to mortal sin. Reply to Obj. 1. Augustine is referring to the fact of many venial sins making one mortal sin dispositively. Reply to Obj. 2. The same movement of the sensuality, which preceded the consent of reason, can never become a mortal sin. But the movement of the reason in consenting is a mortal sin. Reply to Obj. 3. Disease of the body is not an act, but an abiding disposition. Wherefore, while remaining the same disease, it may undergo change. On the other hand, venial sin is a transient act, which cannot be taken up again, so that in this respect the comparison fails. Reply to Obj. 4. A disposition that becomes a habit is like an imperfect thing in the same species. Thus, imperfect science, by being perfected, becomes a habit. On the other hand, venial sin is a disposition to something differing generically, even as an accident which disposes to a substantial form, into which it is never changed. Fifth Article. Whether a circumstance can make a venial sin to be mortal? Objection 1. It would seem that a circumstance can make a venial sin mortal. For Augustine says in a sermon on Purgatory that if anger continue for a long time, or if drunkenness be frequent, they become mortal sins. But anger and drunkenness are not mortal but venial sins generically, else they would always be mortal sins. Therefore, a circumstance makes a venial sin to be mortal. Obj. 2: Further, the Master says in his Sentences 2d24 that delectation, if morose, is a mortal sin, but that if it not be morose, it is a venial sin. Now moroseness is a circumstance. Therefore, a circumstance makes a venial sin to be mortal. Obj. 3: Further, evil and good differ more than venial and mortal sin, both of which are generically evil. But a circumstance makes a good act to be evil, as when a man gives an alms for vainglory. Much more, therefore, can it make a venial sin to be mortal. On the contrary, since a circumstance is an accident, its quantity cannot exceed that of the act itself, derived from the act's genus, because the subject always excels its accident. If therefore an act be venial by reason of its genus, it cannot become mortal by reason of an accident, since, in a way, mortal sin infinitely surpasses the quantity of venial sin, as is evident from what has been said in question 72, Article 5, first reply, and in question 87, Article 5, first reply. I answer that, as stated above in question 7, Article 1, question 18, Article 5, fourth reply, and in Articles 10 and 11, when we were treating of circumstances, a circumstance, as such, is an accident of the moral act. And yet a circumstance may happen to be taken as the specific difference of a moral act, and then it loses its nature of circumstance, and constitutes the species of the moral act. This happens in sins when a circumstance adds the deformity of another genus. Thus, when a man has knowledge of another woman than his wife, the deformity of his act is opposed to chastity. But if this other be another man's wife, there is an additional deformity opposed to justice, which forbids one to take what belongs to another. And accordingly, this circumstance constitutes a new species of sin known as adultery. It is, however, impossible for a circumstance to make a venial sin become mortal, unless it adds the deformity of another species. For it has been stated above in Article 1 that the deformity of a venial sin consists in a disorder affecting things that are referred to the end, whereas the deformity of a mortal sin consists in a disorder about the last end. Consequently, it is evident that a circumstance cannot make a venial sin to be mortal, so long as it remains a circumstance, but only when it transfers the sin to another species, and becomes, as it were, the specific difference of the moral act. Reply to Obj. 1. Length of time is not a circumstance that draws a sin to another species, nor is frequency or custom, except perhaps by something accidental supervening. For an action does not acquire a new species through being repeated or prolonged, unless by chance something supervene in the repeated or prolonged act to change its species, for example, disobedience, contempt, or the like. We must therefore reply to the objection by saying that since anger is a movement of the soul tending to the hurt of one's neighbor, if the angry movement tend to a hurt which is mortal sin generically, such as murder or robbery, that anger will be a mortal sin generically. And if it be a venial sin, this will be due to the imperfection of the act, in so far as it is a sudden movement of the sensuality. Whereas, if it last a long time, it returns to its generic nature, through the consent of reason. If, on the other hand, the hurt to which the angry movement tends is a sin generically venial, for instance, if a man be angry with someone so as to wish to say some trifling word in jest that would hurt him a little, the anger will not be mortal sin, however long it lasts, unless perhaps accidentally, for instance, if it were to give rise to great scandal, or something of the kind. With regard to drunkenness, we reply that it is a mortal sin by reason of its genus, for that a man, without necessity, and through the mere lust of wine, makes himself unable to use his reason, whereby he is directed to God and avoids committing many sins, is expressly contrary to virtue. That it be a venial sin is due to some sort of ignorance or weakness, as when a man is ignorant of the strength of the wine, or of his own unfitness, so that he has no thought of getting drunk, for in that case the drunkenness is not imputed to him as a sin, but only the excessive drink. If, however, he gets drunk frequently, this ignorance no longer avails as an excuse, for his will seems to choose to give way to drunkenness rather than to refrain from excessive wine, wherefore the sin returns to its specific nature. Reply Obj. 2: Morose delectation is not a mortal sin except in those matters which are mortal sins generically. In such matters, if the delectation be not morose, there is a venial sin through imperfection of the act, as we have said with regard to anger, in the first reply. Because anger is said to be lasting, and delectation to be morose, on account of the approval of the deliberating reason. Reply Obj. 3: A circumstance does not make a good act to be evil, unless it constitute the species of a sin, as we have stated above in Q. 18, A. 5, fourth reply. Sixth article: Whether a mortal sin can become venial? Objection 1: It would seem that a mortal sin can become venial. Because venial sin is equally distant from mortal, as mortal sin is from venial. But a venial sin can become mortal, as stated above in A. 5. Therefore also a mortal sin can become venial. Obj. 2: Further, venial and mortal sin are said to differ in this, that he who sins mortally loves a creature more than God, while he who sins venially loves the creature less than God. Now it may happen that a person in committing a sin generically mortal loves a creature less than God. For instance, if anyone being ignorant that simple fornication is a mortal sin, and contrary to the love of God, commits the sin of fornication, yet so as to be ready for the love of God to refrain from that sin, if he knew that by committing it he was acting counter to the love of God. Therefore his will be a venial sin, and accordingly a mortal sin can become venial. Obj. 3: Further, as stated above in A. 5, Obj. 3, good is more distant from evil than venial from mortal sin. But an act which is evil in itself can become good. Thus to kill a man may be an act of justice, as when a judge condemns a thief to death. Much more therefore can a mortal sin become venial. On the contrary, an eternal thing can never become temporal. But mortal sin deserves eternal punishment, whereas venial sin deserves temporal punishment. Therefore a mortal sin can never become venial. I answer that, venial and mortal differ as perfect and imperfect in the genus of sin, as stated above in A. 1, first reply. Now the imperfect can become perfect by some sort of addition, and consequently a venial sin can become mortal by the addition of some deformity pertaining to the genus of mortal sin, as when a man utters an idle word for the purpose of fornication. On the other hand, the perfect cannot become imperfect by addition, and so a mortal sin cannot become venial by the addition of a deformity pertaining to the genus of venial sin, for the sin is not diminished if a man commit fornication in order to utter an idle word; rather it is aggravated by the additional deformity. Nevertheless, a sin which is generically mortal can become venial by reason of the imperfection of the act, because then it does not completely fulfill the conditions of a moral act, since it is not a deliberate but a sudden act, as is evident from what we have said above in A. 2. This happens by a kind of subtraction, namely, of deliberate reason. And since a moral act takes its species from deliberate reason, the result is that by such a subtraction the species of the act is destroyed. Reply to Obj. 1. Venial differs from mortal as imperfect from perfect, even as a boy differs from a man. But the boy becomes a man and not vice versa. Hence the argument does not prove. Reply to Obj. 2. If the ignorance be such as to excuse sin altogether, as the ignorance of a madman or an imbecile, then he that commits fornication in a state of such ignorance commits no sin either mortal or venial. But if the ignorance be not invincible, then the ignorance itself is a sin, and contains within itself the lack of the love of God, in so far as a man neglects to learn those things whereby he can safeguard himself in the love of God. Reply to Obj. 3. As Augustine says in Against Lying 7, "Those things which are evil in themselves cannot be well done for any good end." Now murder is the slaying of the innocent, and this can nowise be well done. But as Augustine states in On Free Will 1, 4, 5, the judge who sentences a thief to death, or the soldier who slays the enemy of the common weal, are not murderers. End of question 88. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 89 of Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae. Treatise on habits in particular, evil habits, that is, vices and sins. By St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 89. Of venial sin in itself, in 6 articles. We must now consider venial sin in itself, and under this head there are 6 points of inquiry. First, whether venial sin causes a stain in the soul. Second, of the different kinds of venial sin, as denoted by wood, hay, stubble, as referring to 1 Corinthians 3:12. Third, whether man could sin venially in the state of innocence. Fourth, whether a good or wicked angel can sin venially. Fifth, whether the movements of unbelievers are venial sins. Sixth, whether venial sin can be in a man with original sin alone. First article. Whether venial sin causes a stain on the soul. Objection 1. It would seem that venial sin causes a stain in the soul. For Augustine says that if venial sins be multiplied, they destroy the beauty of our souls so as to deprive us of the embraces of our heavenly spouse. But the stain of sin is nothing else but the loss of the soul's beauty. Therefore, venial sins cause a stain in the soul. Objection 2. Further, mortal sin causes a stain in the soul on account of the inordinateness of the act and of the sinner's affections. But in venial sin there is an inordinateness of the act and of the affections. Therefore, venial sin causes a stain in the soul. Objection 3. Further, the stain on the soul is caused by contact with a temporal thing, through love thereof, as stated above, in question 86, Article 1. But in venial sin, the soul is in contact with the temporal thing through inordinate love. Therefore, venial sin brings a stain on the soul. On the contrary, it is written in Ephesians 5:27, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle. On which the gloss says, "This is some grievous sin." Therefore, it seems proper to mortal sin to cause a stain on the soul. I answer that, as stated above in question 86, Article 1, a stain denotes a loss of comeliness due to contact with something, as may be seen in corporeal matters, from which the term has been transferred to the soul by way of similitude. Now, just as in the body there is a twofold comeliness, one resulting from the inward disposition of the members and colors, the other resulting from outward refulgence supervening, so too in the soul there is a twofold comeliness, one habitual and, so to speak, intrinsic, the other actual, like an outward flash of light. Now venial sin is a hindrance to actual comeliness, but not to habitual comeliness, because it neither destroys nor diminishes the habit of charity and of the other virtues, as we shall show further on, in the Pars Secundae, question 24, Article 10, as well as in question 133, Article 1, second reply. But only hinders their acts. On the other hand, a stain denotes something permanent in the thing stained, wherefore it seems in the nature of a loss of habitual rather than of actual comeliness. Therefore, properly speaking, venial sin does not cause a stain in the soul. If, however, we find it stated anywhere that it does induce a stain, this is in a restricted sense, in so far as it hinders the comeliness that results from acts of virtue. Reply to Obj. 1. Augustine is speaking of the case in which many venial sins lead to mortal sin dispositively, because otherwise they would not sever the soul from its heavenly spouse. Reply to Obj. 2. In mortal sin, the inordinateness of the act destroys the habit of virtue, but not in venial sin. Reply to Obj. 3. In mortal sin, the soul comes into contact with a temporal thing as to its end, so that the shedding of the light of grace, which accrues to those who by charity cleave to God as their last end, is entirely cut off. On the contrary, in venial sin, man does not cleave to a creature as his last end. Hence there is no comparison. Second article. Whether venial sins are suitably designated as wood, hay, and stubble. Objection 1. It would seem that venial sins are unsuitably designated as wood, hay, and stubble. Because wood, hay, and stubble are said in 1 Corinthians 3:12 to be built on a spiritual foundation. Now venial sins are something outside a spiritual foundation, even as false opinions are outside the pale of science. Therefore, venial sins are not suitably designated as wood, hay, and stubble. Objection 2. Further, he who builds wood, hay, and stubble shall be saved yet so as by fire, as stated in 1 Corinthians 3:15. But sometimes the man who commits a venial sin will not be saved even by fire, for example, when a man dies in mortal sin to which venial sins are attached. Therefore venial sins are unsuitably designated by wood, hay, and stubble. Obj. 3: Further, according to the Apostle in 1 Corinthians 3:12, those who build gold, silver, precious stones, that is, love of God and our neighbor and good works, are others from those who build wood, hay, and stubble. But those even who love God and their neighbor and do good works commit venial sins, for it is written in 1 John 1:8, "If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves." Therefore venial sins are not suitably designated by these three. Obj. 4: Further, there are many more than three differences and degrees of venial sins. Therefore they are unsuitably comprised under these three. On the contrary, the Apostle says in 1 Corinthians 3:15 that the man who builds up wood, hay, and stubble "shall be saved, yet so as by fire," so that he will suffer punishment, but not everlasting. Now the debt of temporal punishment belongs properly to venial sin, as stated above in Q. 87, A. 5. Therefore these three signify venial sins. I answer that, some have understood the foundation to be dead faith, upon which some build good works, signified by gold, silver, and precious stones, while others build mortal sins, which according to them are designated by wood, hay, and stubble. But Augustine disapproves of this explanation (On Faith and Works 15), because, as the Apostle says in Gal. 5:21, he who does the works of the flesh "shall not obtain the kingdom of God," which signifies to be saved. Whereas the Apostle says that he who builds wood, hay, and stubble "shall be saved, yet so as by fire." Consequently, wood, hay, stubble cannot be understood to denote mortal sins. Others say that wood, hay, stubble designate good works, which are indeed built upon the spiritual edifice, but are mixed with venial sins, as when a man is charged with the care of a family, which is a good thing, excessive love of his wife or of his children or of his possessions insinuates itself into his life, under God, however, so that, to wit, for the sake of these things he would be unwilling to do anything in opposition to God. But neither does this seem to be reasonable, for it is evident that all good works are referred to the love of God and one's neighbor, wherefore they are designated by gold, silver, and precious stones, and consequently not by wood, hay, and stubble. We must therefore say that the very venial sins that insinuate themselves into those who have a care for earthly things are designated by wood, hay, and stubble. For just as these are stored in a house without belonging to the substance of the house, and can be burnt, while the house is saved, so also venial sins are multiplied in a man, while the spiritual edifice remains, and for them man suffers fire, either of temporal trials in this life, or of purgatory after this life, and yet he is saved forever. Reply to Obj. 1: Venial sins are not said to be built upon the spiritual foundation as though they were laid directly upon it, but because they are laid beside it, in the same sense as it is written in Psalm 136:1, "Upon the waters of Babylon," that is, beside the waters, because venial sins do not destroy the edifice. Reply to Obj. 2: It is not said that everyone who builds wood, hay, and stubble shall be saved as by fire, but only those who build upon the foundation. And this foundation is not dead faith, as some have esteemed, but faith quickened by charity, according to Ephesians 3:17. Rooted and founded in charity. Accordingly, he that dies in mortal sin with venial sins has indeed wood, hay, and stubble, but not built upon the spiritual edifice, and consequently he will not be saved so as by fire. Reply to Obj. 3. Although those who are withdrawn from the care of temporal things sin venially sometimes, yet they commit but slight venial sins, and in most cases they are cleansed by the fervor of charity, wherefore they do not build up venial sins, because these do not remain long in them. But the venial sins of those who are busy about earthly things remain longer, because they are unable to have such frequent recourse to the fervor of charity in order to remove them. Reply to Obj. 4. As the Philosopher says in On the Heavens i, 2, all things are comprised under three: the beginning, the middle, the end. Accordingly, all degrees of venial sins are reduced to three, notably, to wood, which remains longer in the fire; stubble, which is burnt up at once; and hay, which is between these two. Because venial sins are removed by fire, quickly or slowly, according as man is more or less attached to them. Third article. Whether man could commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. Objection 1. It would seem that man could commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. Because, on 1 Timothy 2:14, Adam was not seduced. A gloss says, having had no experience of God's severity, it was possible for him to be so mistaken as to think that what he had done was a venial sin. But he would not have thought this unless he could have committed a venial sin. Therefore, he could commit a venial sin without sinning mortally. Obj. 2: Further, Augustine says on the literal interpretation of Genesis 11:5, we must not suppose that the tempter would have overcome man, unless first of all there had arisen in man's soul a movement of vainglory, which should have been checked. Now the vainglory which preceded man's defeat, which was accomplished through his falling into mortal sin, could be nothing more than a venial sin. In like manner, Augustine says on the literal interpretation of Genesis 11:5 that man was allured by a certain desire of making the experiment, when he saw that the woman did not die when she had taken the forbidden fruit. Again, there seems to have been a certain movement of unbelief in Eve, since she doubted what the Lord had said, as appears from her saying in Genesis 3:3, "Lest perhaps we die." Now these apparently were venial sins. Therefore man could commit a venial sin before he committed a mortal sin. Obj. 3: Further, mortal sin is more opposed to the integrity of the original state than venial sin is. Now man could sin mortally notwithstanding the integrity of the original state. Therefore he could also sin venially. On the contrary, every sin deserves some punishment. But nothing penal was possible in the state of innocence, as Augustine declares in De Civ. Dei xiv:10. Therefore he could not commit a sin that would not deprive him of that state of integrity. But venial sin does not change man's state. Therefore he could not sin venially. I answer that, it is generally admitted that man could not commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. This, however, is not to be understood as though, on account of the perfection of his state, the sin which is venial for us would have been mortal for him if he had committed it. Because the dignity of a person is circumstance that aggravates a sin, but it does not transfer it to another species, unless there be an additional deformity by reason of disobedience, or vow, or the like, which does not apply to the question in point. Consequently, what is venial in itself cannot be changed into mortal by reason of the excellence of the original state. We must therefore understand this to mean that he could not sin venially, because it was impossible for him to commit a sin which was venial in itself, before losing the integrity of the original state by sinning mortally. The reason for this is because venial sin occurs in us, either through the imperfection of the act, as in the case of sudden movements, in a genus of mortal sin, or through some inordinateness in respect of things referring to the end, the due order of the end being safeguarded. Now each of these things happens on account of some defect of order, by reason of the lower powers not being checked by the higher. Because the sudden rising of a movement of the sensuality in us is due to the sensuality not being perfectly subject to reason, and the sudden rising of a movement of reason itself is due, in us, to the fact that the execution of the act of reason is not subject to the act of deliberation which proceeds from a higher good, as stated above in Q. 74, A. 10. And that the human mind be out of order as regards things directed to the end, the due order of the end being safeguarded, is due to the fact that the things referred to the end are not infallibly directed under the end, which holds the highest place, being the beginning, as it were, in matters concerning the appetite, as stated above, in Q. 10, AA. 1 and 2, and in Q. 72, A. 5. Now in the state of innocence, as stated in the first part, Q. 95, A. 1, there was an unerring stability of order, so that the lower powers were always subjected to the higher, so long as man remained subject to God, as Augustine says (De Civ. Dei xiv, 13). Hence there can be no inordinateness in man, unless first of all the highest part of man were not subject to God, which constitutes a mortal sin. From this it is evident that, in the state of innocence, man could not commit a venial sin before committing a mortal sin. Reply to Obj. 1: In the passage quoted, venial is not taken in the same sense as we take it now, but by venial sin we mean that which is easily forgiven. Reply to Obj. 2: This vainglory which preceded man's downfall was his first mortal sin, for it is stated to have preceded his downfall into the outward act of sin. This vainglory was followed, in the man, by the desire to make and experiment, and in the woman, by doubt, for she gave way to vainglory merely through hearing the serpent mention the precept, as though she refused to be held in check by the precept. Reply to Obj. 3: Mortal sin is opposed to the integrity of the original state in the fact of its destroying that state. This a venial sin cannot do. And because the integrity of the primitive state is incompatible with any inordinateness whatever, the result is that the first man could not sin venially before committing a mortal sin. Fourth Article. Whether a good or a wicked angel can sin venially? Objection 1. It seems that a good or wicked angel can sin venially. Because man agrees with the angels in the higher part of his soul, which is called the mind, according to Gregory, who says in his Homily 29 on the Gospel that "man understands in common with the angels." But man can commit a venial sin in the higher part of his soul. Therefore an angel can commit a venial sin also. Obj. 2: Further, he that can do more can do less. But an angel could love a created good more than God, and he did, by sinning mortally. Therefore he could also love a creature less than God inordinately, by sinning venially. Obj. 3: Further, wicked angels seem to do things which are venial sins generically, by provoking men to laughter and other like frivolities. Now the circumstance of the person does not make a mortal sin to be venial, as stated above in A. 3, unless there is a special prohibition, which is not the case in point. Therefore an angel can sin venially. On the contrary, the perfection of an angel is greater than that of man in the primitive state. But man could not sin venially in the primitive state, and much less, therefore, can an angel. I answer that, an angel's intellect, as stated above in the first part, in Q. 58, A. 3, and in Q. 79, A. 8, is not discursive, that is, it does not proceed from principles to conclusions so as to understand both separately, as we do. Consequently, whenever the angelic intellect considers a conclusion, it must of necessity consider it in its principles. Now in matters of appetite, as we have often stated, in Q. 8, A. 2, in Q. 10, A. 1, and in Q. 72, A. 5, ends are like principles, while the means are like conclusions. Wherefore an angel's mind is not directed to the means, except as they stand under the order to the end. Consequently, from their very nature, they can have no inordinateness in respect of the means, unless at the same time they have an inordinateness in respect of the end, and this is a mortal sin. Now good angels are not moved to the means except in subordination to the due end which is God. Wherefore all their acts are acts of charity, so that no venial sin can be in them. On the other hand, wicked angels are moved to nothing except in subordination to the end which is their sin of pride. Therefore they sin mortally in everything that they do of their own will. This does not apply to the appetite for the natural good, which appetite we have stated to be in them, as stated in the Pars Prima, Q. 63, A. 4, and in Q. 64, A. 2, fifth reply. Reply to Obj. 1. Man does indeed agree with the angels in the mind or intellect, but he differs in his mode of understanding, as stated above. Reply to Obj. 2. An angel could not love a creature less than God, without, at the same time, either referring it to God as the last end, or to some inordinate end, for the reason given above. Reply to Obj. 3. The demons incite man to all such things which seem venial, that he may become used to them, so as to lead him on to mortal sin. Consequently, in all such things they sin mortally, on account of the end they have in view. Fifth article. Whether the first movements of the sensuality in unbelievers are mortal sin? Objection 1. It would seem that the first movements of the sensuality in unbelievers are mortal sins. For the Apostle says in Romans 8:1 that "there is no condemnation to them that are in Christ Jesus, who walk not according to the flesh." And he is speaking there of the concupiscence of the sensuality, as appears from the context in Romans 7. Therefore, the reason why concupiscence is not a matter of condemnation to those who walk not according to the flesh, that is, by consenting to concupiscence, is because they are in Christ Jesus. But unbelievers are not in Christ Jesus. Therefore, in unbelievers this is a matter of condemnation. Therefore, the first movements of unbelievers are mortal sins. Objection 2: Further, Anselm says (On Grace and Free Will, 7): "Those who are not in Christ, when they feel the sting of the flesh, follow the road of damnation, even if they walk not according to the flesh." But damnation is not due save to mortal sin. Therefore, since man feels the sting of the flesh in the first movements of the concupiscence, it seems that the first movements of concupiscence in unbelievers are mortal sins. Obj. 3: Further, Anselm says (On Grace and Free Will, 7): "Man was so made that he was not liable to feel concupiscence." Now this liability seems to be remitted to man by the grace of baptism, which the unbeliever has not. Therefore every act of concupiscence in an unbeliever, even without his consent, is a mortal sin, because he acts against his duty. On the contrary, it is stated in Acts 10:34 that "God is not a respecter of persons." Therefore he does not impute to one unto condemnation what he does not impute to another. But he does not impute first movements to believers unto condemnation. Neither therefore does he impute them to unbelievers. I answer that, it is unreasonable to say that the first movements of unbelievers are mortal sins, when they do not consent to them. This is evident for two reasons. First, because the sensuality itself could not be the subject of mortal sin, as stated above (Q. 79, A. 4). Now the sensuality has the same nature in unbelievers as in believers. Therefore it is not possible for the mere movements of the sensuality in unbelievers to be mortal sins. Secondly, from the state of the sinner. Because excellence of the person never diminishes sin, but on the contrary increases it, as stated above in Q. 73, A. 10. Therefore a sin is not less grievous in a believer than in an unbeliever, but much more so. For the sins of an unbeliever are more deserving of forgiveness on account of their ignorance, according to 1 Timothy 1:13: "I obtained the mercy of God, because I did it ignorantly in my unbelief": whereas the sin of believers are more grievous on account of the sacraments of grace, according to Heb. 10:29: "How much more do you think he deserveth worse punishments, who hath esteemed the blood of the testament unclean, by which he was sanctified?" Reply Obj. 1: The Apostle is speaking of the condemnation due to original sin, which condemnation is remitted by the grace of Jesus Christ, although the fomes of concupiscence remain. Wherefore the fact that believers are subject to concupiscence is not in them a sign of the condemnation due to original sin, as it is in unbelievers. In this way also is to be understood the saying of Anselm, wherefore the reply to the second objection is evident. Reply to Obj. 3. This freedom from liability to concupiscence was a result of original justice. Wherefore that which is opposed to such liability pertains not to actual, but to original sin. Sixth article. Whether venial sin can be in anyone with original sin alone. Objection 1. It would seem that venial sin can be in a man with original sin alone. For disposition precedes habit. Now venial sin is a disposition to mortal sin, as stated above in Question 88, Article 3. Therefore, in an unbeliever in whom original sin is not remitted, venial sin exists before mortal sin, and so sometimes unbelievers have venial together with original sin, and without mortal sins. Objection 2. Further, venial sin has less in common and less connection with mortal sin than one mortal sin has with another. But an unbeliever in the state of original sin can commit one mortal sin without committing another. Therefore, he can also commit a venial sin without committing a mortal sin. Obj. 3. Further, it is possible to fix the time at which a child is first able to commit an actual sin, and when the child comes to that time, it can stay a short time at least without committing a mortal sin, because this happens in the worst criminals. Now, it is possible for the child to sin venially during that space of time, however short it may be. Therefore, venial sin can be in anyone with original sin alone, and without mortal sin. On the contrary, man is punished for original sin in the children's limbo, where there is no pain of sense, as we shall state further on, in the Pars Secunda Secundae, question 69, Article 6. Whereas men are punished in hell for no other than mortal sin. Therefore, there will be no place where a man can be punished for venial sin with no other than original sin. I answer that, it is impossible for venial sin to be in anyone with original sin alone, and without mortal sin. The reason for this is because, before a man comes to the age of discretion, the lack of years hinders the use of reason and excuses him from mortal sin, wherefrom much more does it excuse him from venial sin, if he does anything which is such generically. But when he begins to have the use of reason, he is not entirely excused from the guilt of venial or mortal sin. Now the first thing that occurs to a man to think about then is to deliberate about himself. And if he then direct himself to the due end, he will, by means of grace, receive the remission of original sin. Whereas, if he does not then direct himself to the due end, as far as he is capable of discretion at that particular age, he will sin mortally, through not doing that which is in his power to do. Accordingly, thenceforward there cannot be venial sin in him without mortal, until afterwards all sin shall have been remitted to him through grace. Reply to Obj. 1. Venial sin always precedes mortal sin, not as a necessary, but as a contingent disposition, just as work sometimes disposes to fever, but not as heat disposes to the form of fire. Reply to Obj. 2. Venial sin is prevented from being with original sin alone, not on account of its want of connection or likeness, but on account of the lack of use of reason, as stated above. Reply Obj. 3: The child that is beginning to have the use of reason can refrain from other mortal sins for a time, but it is not free from the aforesaid sin of omission, unless it turns to God as soon as possible. For the first thing that occurs to a man who has discretion is to think of himself, and to direct other things to himself as to their end, since the end is the first thing in the intention. Therefore this is the time when man is bound by God's affirmative precept, which the Lord expressed by saying (Zech. 1:3): "Turn ye to me, and I will turn to you." End of question 89. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. End of Summa Theologica pars Prima Secundae, Treatise on Habits, Virtues and Vices.